What makes certain leaders unstoppable, while others crumble under pressure? Why did Steve Jobs, despite failures, betrayal, when exile from his own company, return to rule the tech world like a Renaissance prince? Today, we reveal the ancient Machiavellian power technique that separated Jobs from the rest, and how you can use it to dominate your field. In The Prince, Machiavelli makes a claim that is as dangerous as it is effective. It is not necessary for a prince to have all the good qualities, but it is very necessary to appear to have them. In other words, how you are seen matters more than who you truly are. For those seeking power, reality is optional. Perception is everything. This single principle became one of the invisible pillars of Steve Jobs' dominance. Jobs, like a true Machiavellian, understood that human beings are drawn not to truth, but to spectacle, to myth, to appearances that stir emotion and awe. And he used this principle with devastating precision. Steve Jobs was not the best engineer at Apple. He didn't write code. He was not the kindest leader, nor the most forgiving. But to the outside world, and often to his employees, he appeared God-like, a futurist, a design prophet, a genius untouched by the ordinary constraints of the corporate world. This image was not accidental. It was constructed, curated, and performed with obsessive care. His iconic uniform, black turtleneck, jeans, New Balance sneakers, was no fashion afterthought. It was a uniform of simplicity and purpose, calculated to project minimalism, clarity, and a monk-like devotion to his vision. When Jobs stepped onto a stage, he didn't just give a product demo, he orchestrated a ritual. The lighting, the silence, the pacing of his words, all of it was engineered to create a sense of reverence. People didn't clap because they understood what was being unveiled. They clapped because they felt they were in the presence of someone larger than life. Machiavelli advised rulers to control not only their own image, but the way their actions were interpreted. Jobs obeyed this dictum instinctively. When he introduced a new product, it wasn't just a tool, it was revolutionary. The iPod didn't just play music, it freed music. The iPhone wasn't just a phone, it was a leap forward in human communication. His choice of words, his metaphors, even the pauses in his sentences were weapons of perception. His narrative turned cold hardware into sacred objects. People believed. They didn't even know why. Machiavelli also warns that men judge by the eye rather than the hand, because everyone sees what you appear to be, but few truly experience what you are. Jobs leveraged this perfectly. He concealed the chaos within Apple, the stress, the arguments, the breakdowns. To the world, Apple was the temple of innovation, run by a serene, intuitive genius. But behind the curtain, Jobs could be manipulative, temperamental, and dismissive. None of that mattered, because the public saw something else entirely. And they loved what they saw. Even failure was transformed into narrative power. When Jobs was ousted from Apple in 1985, many would have vanished into obscurity. But Jobs rewrote the perception. He didn't leave in disgrace. He was a misunderstood visionary, betrayed by bureaucrats. His exile was reframed as a pilgrimage. He started NXT and bought Pixar, giving the impression of forward motion, of constant evolution. He wasn't just surviving. He was preparing for a return. And when he did return, the perception became prophecy fulfilled. It wasn't just a CEO coming back. It was a prodigal genius reclaiming his rightful throne. The myth had been completed. Jobs also mastered the use of mystery, a tactic Machiavelli recommends to princes. By revealing only what was necessary and hiding what was not, Jobs created tension and anticipation. He never over-explained. Apple never leaked prematurely. Secrecy became part of the show. And with each new product launch, the world waited, hungry for the next revelation. That's not just marketing. That's Machiavellian theater. While other CEOs were dressing in suits, speaking in spreadsheets, and attending shareholder meetings with carefully diluted corporate language, Jobs was building a myth. He wasn't a manager. He was a prophet. He made audiences feel like they were being taken into the future. Not sold to, but led. That is the power of controlled perception. You don't need to be the smartest, or the kindest, or even the most correct. You only need to appear indispensable. And this power, Machiavelli would argue, is far more enduring than truth. Machiavelli's most chilling and enduring advice comes from one of the most debated passages in The Prince. It is much safer to be feared than loved, if one has to choose. But he adds a crucial condition: the prince must avoid being hated. The true Machiavellian ruler strikes a delicate balance. A cocktail of calculated cruelty, cold charisma, and undeniable competence. Steve Jobs didn't rule by kindness. He didn't motivate his teams through comfort or consensus. He ruled through a volatile, magnetic mix of fear and admiration. And it worked brilliantly. Jobs' leadership style has often been called abrasive, tyrannical, even brutal. Employees spoke of meetings where they were publicly humiliated, fired on the spot, or made to feel intellectually inadequate. He was known to call people's work shit to their face. He demanded nothing less than perfection. And if someone failed to meet that standard, he let them know it in no uncertain terms. But despite this, perhaps because of it, people stayed. They didn't just tolerate his intensity, they revered it. They worked longer, harder, more obsessively, not in spite of the fear he instilled, but because of it. This is the Machiavellian paradox: fear, when wielded with purpose and restraint, can deepen loyalty. Jobs didn't inspire the affection of a warm-hearted mentor. He inspired the awe of a demanding visionary. People feared disappointing him more than they feared losing their job. But they also respected him, because his brutality wasn't arbitrary. It was in service of a larger vision. Like Machiavelli's ideal prince, he punished only when necessary, not for pleasure, but to discipline, to refine, to drive progress. There's a deep psychological principle at play here. When a leader blends fear with undeniable competence, followers interpret the cruelty as a form of honesty. They believe that the leader sees something they don't, that the anger is not random but prophetic. Jobs wasn't just yelling. He was revealing a flaw in the work, a weakness in the product, a danger to the mission. That belief transformed his criticism into a kind of twisted motivation. Employees would walk out of meetings crushed, only to return the next day determined to prove themselves worthy. But the fear wasn't the whole story. There was also admiration. People respected Jobs not because he made them feel good, but because he made them better. He had a vision, and he pushed people to rise to it. In the Machiavellian world, love is fickle, but respect, earned through strength and results, is enduring. Jobs' ability to see potential in a product or a person, even when no one else did, created a kind of mythos around him. He became not just a leader, but a force of nature, a standard by which greatness was measured. Machiavelli also warned that a ruler must be unpredictable. If he is too gentle, people will grow lazy. If he is too cruel, they will rebel. But if he is inconsistent, if people never know what to expect, they will remain alert, on edge, constantly striving to win favor. Jobs played this game masterfully. He could be charming in one moment and terrifying in the next. He might praise a team during a keynote, then eviscerate them in private. This emotional volatility was not weakness. It was strategy. It created a sense of danger, and danger creates focus. Another Machiavellian tactic Jobs used was the elevation of loyalty through selective reward. Jobs would praise only those whose work truly met his standards. And when he did, it meant everything. A nod from Jobs, a compliment in front of peers. It had the weight of royal favor. These rare moments of approval created an emotional economy inside Apple, one where his judgment was the currency of value. People worked not just for money, but for recognition from the king. And that made Jobs more than a CEO. It made him the arbiter of worth. Importantly, Jobs avoided the fatal mistake Machiavelli warns against: becoming hated. He may have been feared, but he was never viewed as malicious. Even those who suffered under his leadership often spoke about him with reverence. They saw his flaws as part of his genius. His cruelty was justified by his results. His temper was forgiven because it was in the service of excellence. He was not resented. He was mythologized. The cruelty was framed as necessary, the fire as purifying. In this sense, Jobs embodied the purest form of Machiavellian power. He didn't seek to be liked. He sought to be followed. And people followed him, not because they felt safe, but because they believed he was right. That belief, forged in equal parts awe and anxiety, gave him total command over the hearts and minds of his teams. Machiavelli argued that a prince must know how to use cruelty well, quickly, decisively, and only when it serves a greater purpose. To be effective, ruthlessness must not be reckless, it must be strategic. It must be deployed like a scalpel, not a club. Steve Jobs did not merely understand this principle. He embodied it. His career, both before and after his fall from Apple, is littered with cold, calculated decisions that most would shy away from. These choices often cost friendships, partnerships, or short-term comfort, but they preserved his vision and amplified his power. For Jobs, like a true Machiavellian ruler, the emotional cost of a decision was always secondary to its strategic outcome. In the early days of Apple, Jobs was not sentimental about loyalty or personal history. He removed co-founders, marginalized those who didn't align with his vision, and undercut individuals he once relied on. Even Steve Wozniak, his close friend and technical partner, was eventually pushed aside. Wozniak represented a different approach, a more democratic, engineering-driven culture, while Jobs wanted full control of the product's direction, aesthetics, and impact. To maintain that control, he was willing to cut ties, distance himself, and rewrite the story to cast himself as the sole visionary. This is pure Machiavellian logic. A prince must not be beholden to the past or trapped by sentiment. He must rule the present and shape the future. Jobs' exile from Apple in 1985 is often viewed as his great tragedy, but he used it as a proving ground for even more strategic ruthlessness. Instead of retreating into reflection or self-pity, he founded Nextd, a company with a clear and narrow goals: to build a superior computing platform that would one day become indispensable. Even when Nextd failed to gain significant market share, Jobs held to his vision with iron determination. He cut entire product lines. He laid off large portions of staff. He pivoted from hardware to software. These weren't acts of desperation. They were sacrifices made to preserve the core mission. When Apple eventually bought Nextd, it wasn't because Nextd had succeeded commercially. It was because it had become strategically necessary. That purchase brought Jobs back to Apple and placed him in the perfect position to reclaim power. The entire arc was Machiavellian theater, a prince in exile returning with an army. Upon returning to Apple in 1997, Jobs wasted no time showing that his exile had only sharpened his ruthlessness. The company was bloated, inefficient, drowning in a sea of failed products. Within weeks, Jobs cut Apple's product line by over 70%. Dozens of projects were axed. Entire teams were disbanded. Engineers who had worked for years on products were told their efforts were worthless. It was not diplomacy. It was annihilation. But this purge was strategic. It cleared the way for focus. The streamlined product line made room for the iMac, then the iPod, and eventually the iPhone. This is the core of Machiavellian strategy. A prince must eliminate disorder with swift, decisive acts of necessary cruelty. Ruthlessness extended beyond internal operations. Jobs had no problem declaring war on former allies. He severed Apple's partnership with IBM. He publicly denounced Adobe. He refused to adopt technologies unless they served Apple's vision. He even attacked his own industry, calling PCs trucks and declaring the post-PC era as Apple's domain. These weren't just marketing ploys. They were power plays. Jobs painted Apple as both the future and the resistance, and in doing so, he positioned every competitor as an enemy of progress. By narrowing the battlefield, he amplified the contrast between Apple and everyone else. Machiavelli would recognize this as a classic tactic. Define yourself through conflict, and the people will rally behind you. Jobs also knew when to betray idealism in service of empire. Though he preached simplicity, he allowed increasing complexity in Apple's supply chain when it gave the company more leverage. Though he once championed open systems, he later embraced a walled garden strategy with the App Store and iOS. He justified these contradictions not with explanation, but with results. Power does not require consistency. It requires dominance. Like Machiavelli's prince, Jobs understood that actions must serve outcomes, not ideology. This same ruthlessness was applied to innovation. At Apple, No idea was sacred. Even successful products were subject to execution if they became obstacles. Jobs famously said he was as proud of what we don't do as what we do. The iPod, once a symbol of Apple's rebirth, was slowly phased out in favor of the iPhone. Entire categories were discarded to make room for bigger visions. There was no nostalgia, no loyalty to legacy, only strategic evaluation. If something no longer served Apple's narrative of progress and disruption, it was eliminated. This mirrors Machiavelli's warning. A prince must not hesitate to destroy his own creations if they threaten the future of his rule. In human relationships, too, Jobs exercised calculated detachment. He built up people quickly and tore them down just as fast. He recruited brilliant minds, inspired them to greatness, and then removed them without hesitation if they became liabilities. These decisions, while emotionally devastating to those involved, protected the throne. Apple was never a family. It was a kingdom, and Jobs was its sovereign. Machiavelli understood that a ruler's strength was not built solely on weapons, wealth, or alliances. It was built on belief. A prince must construct a narrative that elevates his position beyond mere authority and into the realm of legend. He must make the people believe that he is not just necessary, but destined. And more than that, he must make them feel like they are a part of his story. Steve Jobs took this principle and wove it into the very DNA of Apple, crafting a grand narrative that made customers into followers, employees into disciples, and products into sacred artifacts. From the earliest days of Apple, Jobs framed himself not as a businessman, but as a rebel, a revolutionary fighting against the establishment. He cast Apple as the underdog, the scrappy innovator challenging the cold, corporate giants like IBM and Microsoft. This positioning wasn't just good branding, it was psychological warfare. It created emotional alignment. Consumers didn't just buy a product, they joined a cause. They weren't purchasing a computer, they were casting a vote for creativity, individuality, and rebellion. Machiavelli wrote that rulers must inspire awe by elevating themselves through spectacle and symbolism. Jobs turned that into an art form. The famous 1984 Apple commercial, directed by Ridley Scott, is a textbook example of Machiavellian myth-making. It depicted Apple as the liberator of the masses, smashing conformity with a hammer of innovation. The enemy was Big Brother, the symbol of centralized control and oppression, clearly a jab at IBM. But more subtly, Jobs positioned himself as the figure behind the liberation, the bringer of fire, the one who would guide humanity into a new age of digital freedom. The ad only aired once on national television, but it imprinted the Apple myth in the public mind forever. This wasn't marketing, it was the beginning of a belief system. Jobs didn't stop there. He understood that a ruler must constantly reinforce the myth, not only with words, but with ritual. Every Apple keynote became a ceremonial event. The room darkened, the screen glowed, and the crowd waited. Jobs would step onto the stage in his black uniform, not dressed for business, but for ascension, and unveil the next big thing. These weren't product launches. They were revelations. The phrases he used: magical, revolutionary, it just works, were not technical descriptions. They were incantations. The faithful didn't need specs or spreadsheets. They believed because he believed. Even the way Apple packaged its products followed the logic of myth. Opening an Apple product felt like unsealing something sacred. The box was minimal, the contents precise, the materials luxurious. Everything was designed to deliver a message. You are not just a user. You are part of something greater. This emotional resonance did not happen by accident. Jobs was known to obsess over the feel of packaging. The unboxing experience, the very texture of the buttons. These details told a story, and the story was always the same. Apple is not just a company. It is a movement. Machiavelli advised rulers to associate themselves with religion. When necessary, not to become priests, but to borrow the aura of sanctity. Jobs achieved this not by invoking gods, but by becoming a kind of secular prophet. He spoke about technology not as tools, but as extensions of human potential. He claimed that Apple existed at the intersection of technology and the liberal arts. A phrase that sounded less like a mission statement and more like scripture. The effect was total devotion. His followers, both inside and outside the company, believed they were reshaping the world. Inside Apple, the myth was just as powerful. Employees were not treated as corporate staff. They were seen as chosen builders of the future. The culture was intense, demanding, and uncompromising. But it was also infused with purpose. People didn't work long hours simply because they were told to. They did it because they felt they were part of a grand design. Jobs fostered this by making the stakes feel higher than mere business. Success wasn't about profit. It was about leaving a dent in the universe. That belief transformed ordinary labor into a sacred mission. Even in conflict, Jobs used narrative to control perception. When Apple faced criticism, whether about labor practices, walled gardens, or pricing, Jobs didn't respond defensively. He reframed the story. He told the public that Apple's control was about protecting the user, not locking them in. He said the closed system ensured security, simplicity, beauty. People accepted this because they trusted the myth. They believed Apple was different, not just another corporation, but a force for good. Machiavelli would recognize this tactic instantly, never apologize for power. Instead, explain it as virtue. In his final years, Jobs became even more mythic. His struggle with illness added a tragic arc to the story. He appeared increasingly gaunt and fragile, but continued to unveil products with undiminished passion. His mortality made his presence feel even more prophetic. He was no longer just a CEO. He was a visionary racing against time. When he passed away, millions mourned, not for a businessman, but for a guiding spirit. People lit candles, held vigils, wrote tributes. The myth had become immortal, and yet, this myth was not built on fantasy alone. It was built on results, vision, spectacle, and above all, control. Steve Jobs controlled the narrative, not because he was lucky, but because he understood something deeply Machiavellian, that power, once believed in, becomes self-sustaining. The prince who crafts a myth rules not by force, but by faith. In the end, Steve Jobs did not rise to power by accident. His genius was not just technical or aesthetic. It was deeply Machiavellian. He mastered the art of perception, making the world see him as a messianic innovator. He balanced fear and respect, ruling Apple not as a friend, but as a feared visionary. He wielded ruthless strategy like a blade, cutting away sentiment and weakness to preserve the mission. And most powerfully, he crafted a myth so compelling that people followed him not out of obligation, but out of belief. Machiavelli wrote, "The prince as a guide for rulers navigating the brutal world of politics and power." Steve Jobs turned those lessons into a blueprint for modern leadership. He didn't just build products. He built an empire of loyalty, control, and awe. So if you seek to lead, not just manage, not just succeed, but dominate, you must do as Jobs did. See the world not as it is, but as it can be shaped. Use perception as your shield, strategy as your sword, and myth as your throne. The crown doesn't belong to the most moral or the most kind. It belongs to the one who understands power and dares to wield it.